Ethics are really, really important in the workplace. If you're not paying attention, it can be really, really bad. And just because you don't have evidence that someone did something immoral doesn't mean you shouldn't ignore your gut when something doesn't feel right. Welcome to the Self-Leadership Experiment, where we take an evidence-based perspective on all things organizational behavior. My name is Scott Dust. I'm a management professor, as well as a team member for an HR tech company. I'll be talking with my co-host, Louis DiCarlo, and we'll break down what's real and what's not, and what works and what doesn't work. Thanks for joining the conversation. Topic of the day is something isn't right. This is all about ethics. So ethics are really, really important in the workplace. We know this. If you're not paying attention, it can be really, really bad. And I would suggest and offer that we really should be erring on the side of caution. And just because you don't have evidence that someone did something immoral doesn't mean you shouldn't ignore your gut when something doesn't feel right. So things like, does it feel like they're leaving out details or withholding sources or maybe reluctant to share information? These should all be signals, and we should be trusting our instincts. And I would think, if you're really in this for the long-term game, you should just walk away. Because if you don't, you might be sorry down the road. And for me, this is getting at this idea of the research is illustrating this connection between affect and emotions, and the fact that physiologically we catch on to things before psychologically we start to logically grasp whatever it is that we're dealing with. There's been all sorts of funky experiments where people are kind of cued with different things that kind of seem off and don't seem right. And, their blood pressure goes up and, physiologically they're changing before they recognize logically that something's happening. So somehow we got to be more aware of these flags.
I agree with you 100%. Ethics is not always straightforward though. I think generally most of the companies or the organizations I've worked for from a high level, they do a very good job of laying down what is ethical and what is not. And a lot of these are very straightforward. Insider trading. No, we can't do that.
Sure.
Can I take bribes from others who are bidding on my business? No, I can't, right? A lot of these are very straightforward, but when you get into practice and you see what's actually happening and going on, everybody has a different interpretation of those ethics in real time. So I think it can get tricky, but you nailed it, right? We generally feel it. We just feel it doesn't feel right before we know it's not right. But how does theory suggest that we get to that point where we actually either say something or walk away?
Right.
I think that's the hard.
Yeah, I think there's some research that's illustrating that there are specific traits or specific cognitive dispositions that make you have a higher likelihood of recognizing that stimuli, things like mindfulness or decentering and self-regulation. And that can be a start, but that's kind of hard to implement or have interventions that can really kind of work in the moment on that. And then I think it's just an ongoing problem, right? If you really think of the definition of ethics, it's recognition that something isn't appropriate based upon social norms. But which social norms is the problem, right? Ethical behavior depends upon whose social norms we're evaluating. So there's different ways that we can think about ethics. So one view, for example, is being utilitarian, right? It's whatever benefits the most people or just maximizes overall happiness for everyone, right? That's one ethical perspective. Where on the other, you might have a moral virtue perspective where it's really about what you do, the behavior, as opposed to the outcome. And so, you have these different perspectives that are being used, and somehow they have to be fleshed out. I would argue that most of the time, organizations, the leadership is embodying a utilitarian perspective, right? You just got to maximize costs because they have so many different players. You got stakeholders, shareholders, clients, customers, employees. I mean, then it just be almost becomes easier to think of ethics in that way because you have so many variables.
I wonder how often though that I'm in a situation at work, it feels weird, there's something off, but do I feel safe or empowered to bring it to someone else's attention? Because usually concerns of that nature get elevated and escalated, and and then what, right? You know, what did I have to gain by really bringing this, whatever this issue is, to someone else's attention? And I, you know, do you have any insight on that? Like, 50% of people, they feel weird, but they don't want to say anything.
Yeah, I think there's a few different things that can mitigate that scenario where somebody maybe feels something's going on, but they're not actually taking action on it. And this is getting at like whistleblower theory and this idea of, you know, they need to feel protected. There has to be a system in place. The extent to which the culture believes in ethics, there needs to be systems that are anonymous and confidential that allows them to report. But still, I mean, it can be detrimental. They have to be willing to kind of take a little bit of risk because nothing's perfect. But then there's also the infractions by another individual, right? So if there's a specific person you feel like is doing something wrong and it impacts you individually, I feel like that's the one where people don't necessarily go and try and fix the problem. They just remove themselves from the situation and they let it go on, which can be, you know, a good strategy for you individually, but it might actually still have implications and problems for others that are in the same environment as you.
Yeah, I bet there's got to be a great case study on Enron, for example, of how much of this went on, how many people had this feeling of, oh, this doesn't feel right.
Right.
And either didn't escalate it because they didn't feel safe, or escalated it and it got ignored.
Right.
And Enron's just one example of this, but I think this happens quite a bit, right? I mean, it's interesting.
Right.
It really is.
This is right. So there's this model of ethical decision making that starts with awareness, and then it goes to judgment, and then intent and behavior. So awareness is just recognizing that there's something bad going on out there. And then judgment is being able to kind of pinpoint what exactly is going on. Intent, I think, is the problem, because intent is getting at this idea of, you know, I'm actually going to take action on it. And I feel like I have the support and the resources and that sense of moral courage. And then I'm actually doing the behavior, right? I'm blowing the whistle, or I'm following up with somebody to make sure this was okay or not, or something like that. So, you know, a lot of times it's the system, but it's also the person or a combination thereof. So not easy.
Yeah, I wonder what type of external factors also have a major influence on speaking up or speaking out. Yeah. You know, if you're really comfortable and okay with potentially shaking up a relationship or ruining, you know, an opportunity in your workplace, right, and you're happy to go somewhere else, I think that makes it easier for you to speak up. But if you truly love what you're doing, yeah, you're really enjoying that environment, right, but there's just this one thing that's really upsetting you. You know, we know what we should do looking backwards, but it's not always easy to make decisions in real time, right?
Yeah, I'll leave with one last statistic that I think supports exactly what you're saying. If you look at the ages of individuals that are the most likely to report unethical behaviors, the youngest employees are the ones that are less likely to report, because they're new to the system. They're still trying to figure out what's going on, and they're still trying to kind of make a name for themselves, and they're kind of more concerned because they don't have as much social capital built up, right? So yeah, all those factors definitely, I would say, you know, go into play. All right, wonderful. So for more resources on bridging the gap between science and practice for all things organization behavior, go to scottdust.com, and from there you can subscribe to the monthly newsletter and find more evidence-based insight through social media, YouTube, and podcasts. Thanks for being here.